Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Boss Level, a movie that I went out of my way to say that I saw on Hulu. Hulu. So I went and I watched this movie, and immediately I was like, you know what? This is a it's a really good movie. It's really very interesting to have like an action sequence that is done with a Groundhog Day like approach. We end up having to reasonably. The whole idea of this movie is to basically have one man conquer this entire day, or he ends up having to repeat the day all over again until ultimately he can conquer everything. And so eventually we have it to where I really did enjoy overall the people within this movie. If anything, some people might be otherwise surprised by some actors or actresses that are ultimately in this movie, like Rob Gronkowski or Will Sasso, of course. If you guys remember Mad TV or the Three Stooges movie remake, um, ultimately we have Mel Gibson in this movie. We ultimately have Frank Grillo, who ultimately had been in the Captain America movies as Crossbones, and ultimately been in the show Kingdom, which ultimately I'd seen. It's a UFC kind of mixed martial arts kind of interesting show. I really enjoyed it. So going into here, we ultimately have seemingly a movie that I thoroughly like. I could say I thoroughly just enjoy the movie. When looking at it, there's some kind of goofy approaches that go on with here. Um, we ultimately have a like certain assassins that have certain quirks that go along within this movie, and like I really just found this movie to be fun. I really found this movie to just be one of those where you can really just enjoy the many like several layers of this movie. Also, oh my god, I almost forgot. Kim Jong is actually in this movie as well as a chef. Um, he's ultimately not an assassin, but he plays an interesting role within this film. But yeah, so there are some pretty good scenes within this movie. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope people like this kind of does feel like a video game like movie, but it also just kind of feels uh, like of course like a Groundhog's Day action packed kind of film kind of approach. Um, we really have it to where they try to justify why Frank Grillo Roy's character has to do all this, but when really looking at it, I'm like, there isn't a real clear cut, like there isn't a real like, oh yeah, I'm gonna buy this reason for why Roy's character is doing all this. They kind of have it to where he's put into some kind of machine of sorts that ultimately is to replay or relay uh, consistently this day over and over and over again. It seems that ultimately this uh, seemingly thing that ultimately Roy is to be a part of is to eventually go into having it to this device could possibly be the end of the world at some point, I guess. Also, it's very odd. We ultimately have it to where Roy, seemingly for this character, there's a lot of things that I can buy, but then there's also times where I'm just like, really? There is some kind of interesting parts within this movie where the pill isn't always easy to swallow, so to speak. But when looking at it, I thought this movie was overall just a fun ride. It was a fun adventure. We have fun assassins. We have fun a fun main character that ultimately takes several attempts. This movie kind of feels like a Dark Souls or like a uh, just otherwise just a normal kind of video game approach to reasonably a movie, which I kind of enjoyed. So that's all I wanted to say in a very cryptic like sense about this movie, because there wasn't much to really say. Uh, really, with how repetitive that this movie goes into, some people might find it annoying. Some people might find it goofy and whatever to see these kind of different attempts and so on and so forth. So let's ultimately go into spoiler time if we haven't already. So, spoiler time. Let's go out of our way to spoil this movie. So, we end up having to our Roy's characters to wake up one day to ultimately live the same day over and over and over and over and over again, to the point of having seemingly one almost 200 and almost to have 200 attempts of this same day over and over and over again. So we ultimately have it to where Roy is to wake up to otherwise justifiably be in a routinely knowing exactly what a villain with a machete is going to do within his home. We have it to where ultimately Roy is kind of giving us a breakdown of what is all going on and how basically he knows every little bit of what this machete person is going to do. To ultimately then we find out there's a helicopter that seemingly appears right in front of his apartment to otherwise just blazingly blow bullets through this guy's entire apartment. We eventually have it to where eventually Roy is to jump out of the building to go and jump into this truck of sorts. So we end up finding out that sometimes we end up having to where Roy ends up getting gunned down via this helicopter. There's sometimes where Roy will ultimately mention that sometimes he didn't make the leap between his window to this truck and ultimately had died. We end up having to where several times that ultimately Roy is ultimately trying to repetitively try to make the same goal every single time that he goes through this day. So we end up finding out that seemingly there is a bulk of assassins that are all after him, to the point of him ultimately going and seemingly getting gunned down at any point and juncture of his day. We end up having it to where there are seemingly two twin guys that are otherwise to come after him and ultimately pump him full of lead. We ultimately have a seemingly a swordsman that is ultimately called Guan Yin, who ultimately goes and consistently kills Roy. To ultimately says, "I am Guan Yin, and I have done this." Like repetitively, to the point of us getting this woman to say this thing numerous times, and then there's sometimes where it's slight variations of what she ends up saying. But man, was this movie just fun. So we end up having to where eventually Roy is to go on here and do several things within his day. We end up having it to where we have kind of a prelude to this day also within this movie to give us a lead up. That ultimately Roy is a person that had applied for a job with his ex-wife, Gemma Wells. Ultimately having us find out that seemingly Roy and Gemma are or have a kid together, which ultimately I guess that is the reason why Gemma had chose to have Roy be in this project. We end up having to ultimately Gemma is going and asking, like, kind of giving us backstory about Roy's character, how recently he's a drunk, and ultimately to follow we'll ultimately see what happens with this character when eventually he gets drunk and stuff like that. So we end up having to where eventually that uh, we have Will Sasso's character Brett come in ultimately to kind of check up on Roy. Told me say like, well, hey, like, is this guy like we do have security measures within this facility, and Gemma acknowledges that, but it's like, well, yeah, but he's like I hired him, so that's the reason why he's here. So we end up having a tour. Brett ends up giving Clive Venter, um, who is played by Mel Gibson, like the information of like, hey, this guy is ultimately here. It seems like Gemma's hiring him, and so you ultimately end up having a tour. Mel Gibson is looking at this guy up and down. He's like, you know what? Like this guy is seemingly a guy that like he starts to describe him as a guy that ultimately seems uh, to not have much of anything. So he is a tryhard or a guy that like tries to make it up for it by not having something. This guy ends up trying to uh, be a tryhard to make up for that. So moving on. So we end up having to ultimately since Roy is being tied to this experiment of sorts, we end up having to where Mel Gibson does not like this character. Like Roy is kind of rubbing Mel Gibson's character the wrong way, and so ultimately we have it to where Clive Venter ultimately tells Brett, it's like, well, hey, like let's get every single assassin that we can to go and kill Roy, and like make sure like you get like the just um, like the freaks of any kind of assassin. Just kind of get like any kind of person that you can possibly get just on this. Just uh, and so we end up having to our Roy is to wake up the next day to ultimately have a woman in his bed that ultimately he had try to win over in a bar, and eventually we also have a man that is going to try to kill him with a machete. So we ultimately have it to where ultimately Roy is to go and consistently kill this machete guy, even at some point torturing him to ask him for information. Eventually, at some point, we end up having to where Roy eventually jumps onto the helicopter way later on into the movie to ultimately need to speed his way to get somewhere, but we'll get to that. So we end up having to where Roy ultimately goes into numerous locations, mainly a restaurant to ultimately get drunk. Because we end up having it to where ultimately we end up having Roy ending up having to consistently every single time go and steal a car from a guy, and ultimately we end up having it to where the guy every single time yells out, "I'm being carjacked," and ultimately Roy ultimately says the exact same thing, "I'm being carjacked, man," and he punches him in the face, and then he runs off with him because he's like severely annoyed with every single time that this guy has to yell this out. So we end up having to ultimately Roy is to go to this cafe to ultimately talk to seemingly Kim Jong, and we eventually have a wide variety of different scenarios that is to go on within this cafe. We end up finding that Dave Vang, ultimately a sword champion, is ultimately bizarrely in this restaurant, perfectly timed. Because ultimately we have Kim Jong, Chef Jake, who uh, ultimately mentions to Roy about this. So ultimately that will otherwise be tied into this movie later. So we end up having to where there's several scenarios that happen into this restaurante. So we end up having it to where Roy ends up going to this restaurant because he realizes that once he gets this restaurant, that ultimately he can get as drunk as humanly possible for quite a bit of time to ultimately, because within that day, or within a certain time period, once he gets to this restaurant, he ultimately will be just pelted with bullets. There's no way to avoid all the onslaught of him eventually getting killed by numerous people during this point in time when eventually he gets to this restaurant. So, because eventually we have it to where Roy otherwise is very much kind of confused of how exactly it seems that all these assassins can find him consistently all the time. And eventually we get it to where ultimately we end up having it uh, to where seemingly Roy is talking to some nerdy guy that ultimately will not shut up about things. And ultimately we eventually have it to where Roy is just paranoidly thinking that maybe it's quite possible that uh, that whoever Roy had worked with Gemma maybe had put a tracker somewhere on Roy. We end up having to where Roy strips down, told me see if there's a tracker anywhere, and he couldn't find anything. So he ends up going to a guy in the restaurant that ultimately didn't talk too much because he's a geeky guy, and ultimately asked like, "Hey, is it possible that they could have put a like a tracker like in my tooth?" And so we end up having Roy like pulling out his teeth one by one to ultimately ask this guy to ultimately see if there's a tracker in his tooth, because we end up finding out that supposedly there had been a dentist that ultimately he had kind of questioned whether or not um, they were kind of doing something tricky. So we end up having it to where Roy ends up pulling out most of his teeth to ultimately have this guy, this tech guy, ultimately look, and ultimately we end up finding out that that Roy had messed with the wrong hombre because they had really extensively tried to find this tracker. So we end up eventually having it to where Roy is eventually going without a tracker, ending up pulling out his teeth seemingly every day. Uh, so that way he could ultimately go and be avoided of trackers. So we end up having to eventually that Roy is to eventually go and meet his son. Ultimately to find out that his son had played hooky for school that day, to ultimately to go into a arcade instead. We ultimately have Roy eventually going and seemingly like noticing that his son had done some shady deal off to the side, so ultimately he questioned him about it, and ultimately his son reveals that ultimately he had just bought a thing of certain cards, and ultimately Roy's like, "Oh, thank God." Like, thank God you're going the straight and narrow here, kid, but kind of doing something shady. So by hookieing school, not going to school. So we end up having to where Roy eventually goes and he spends time with his son, finding out every little bit of knowledge about him. Because eventually we end up finding out that Roy's son, eventually within that day, ends up dying of being murdered. So eventually we have it to where Roy eventually figures out a way to eventually try and kill every single one of these assassins on seemingly one day, to ultimately make it further on into this into him going into uh, Mel Gibson, Clive Venter's headquarters. So because we end up eventually finding out that when Roy is to talk to his son, that his son mentions that ultimately uh, Gemma had called her son within that day, and ultimately when Roy tried to call Clive Venter had mentioned that Gemma was dead, sadly. To ultimately Roy was thinking the whole time that his wife was dead, to the point where ultimately he would just be kind of just reliving some days, hearing that Gemma had died or that his son had died. He had just kind of just rested for the entire day. He had just rested for the entire day and not done anything that ultimately would prevent anything from happening, because he's just like, you know what, like I just want to take certain days and not uh, do anything because I'm just so sad or I'm just so angry or whatever. So moving on. So we have it to where Roy ultimately gets to Mel Gibson's hideout, and eventually we have it to where Roy had killed a bulk of the assassins with the exclusion of Yan or Gon Yin, and so we ultimately have it to where now Roy is trying as much as possible to figure out how to exactly kill this swordsman, and he is putting all kinds of bullets in her, all kinds of things, and nothing is working. And every single time she goes and chops off his head or any kind of number of things and kills him at the end of it all. So, and this guy is basically bringing in like machine guns and all kinds of things, and ultimately nothing is working. So we end up having it to where Roy ends up going into this cafe to eventually remember that Dai Feng, ultimately a champion swordsman, is at this restaurant. So we end up having Roy go to Dai Feng to ultimately ask, hey, could you teach me how to be a really good swordsman? And so we eventually have a very long montage of Roy learning from Feng, and like every single time he goes to like ask her about things, we end up having it to where Roy ultimately kind of like accelerates the knowledge that he has learned through every single day. To like, oh well, hey, like I'm a beginner, but I'd ultimately love to like learn for one day. Or ultimately he ends up mentioning it's like, well, I'm a little bit more experienced, but like I would like to learn more, like, and so on and so forth, just kind of like repetitiously every single day. Ultimately going to Dai Feng and ultimately just trying to get as much knowledge out of one day as humanly possible. Kind of like Bill Murray did with the piano in Groundhog's Day. It's kind of the same thing where I guess you just have to eventually just learn a task within this Groundhog's Day of thing. So we end up having to eventually that Roy is to go in there with this sword assassin and basically just easily eventually take her out. And then we eventually have it to where eventually Roy takes out Brett and basically puts a sword through his head to where ultimately he's just like, "Arr!" And then he drops. And we have it to where Roy ultimately mentions how he's like a 400-pound unicorn with a sword in his head. So we end up having it to ultimately that so Roy is to get a little bit further with Clive Venter, and we end up having it to where seemingly still eventually once he gets closer to Clive Venter, he still gets killed somehow. Um and to ultimately he like the closer and closer that he's able to get to Clive Venter, the more that he's getting a little bit more of dialogue of what Clive Venter is going to say about things, and we also have it to where Gemma uh, had given Roy a birthday present. And so we end up having it to where Roy at some point had to scramble to go and find this birthday present that was at his home to ultimately read this book and ultimately go and realize that ultimately he is in an Osiris device of sorts that ultimately makes it so to where Roy is seemingly going through the same day over and over and over again, and eventually we end up having to where Gemma goes and and is ending up seemingly going and having Roy go through this day over and over and over again because it seems that Gemma needed his help because she knew full well that Clive was dirty, that Mel Gibson's character was dirty, and that ultimately was going to lead to Gemma and her son dying at the end of this day, or at the end of the next day. And so she ended up seeking the help of Roy, which she thought would be the only person to help her, and so ultimately he did. So we end up having to ultimately Roy is to go with Gemma, and ultimately we have it to where uh, Roy tells every single little bit of thing that ultimately he had learned from Gemma's son, and ultimately he had said that uh, that it's like, hey, I read the book, cover to cover. I still don't quite understand what exactly is going on. We eventually have it to where Gemma explains that ultimately he is in some device where it ultimately loops everything, and we eventually have it to where he is to go through this device seemingly again, and he is supposed to ultimately go into this device to ultimately have the one day where he is going to have to flawlessly beat everything, and because he's only going to get one shot at it. So he's going to have to redo the entire day all over again. But this time around, he has to do everything flawlessly, or he will actually die this time around. He doesn't get a do over. So we end up having to tour. Roy ends up going, well, sure, I'll go and do a perfect day, no problem. So we end up having a tour. Roy ends up going into simulus device of sorts, and ultimately is to wake up, ultimately to see the machete in his bed, and we end up having a tour. Roy ends up going like, ha, like I got this, like believe me, I got this. So because we end up having to where Roy ends up going for this last event to make it to where he can get to Clive's headquarters. We end up having to where Roy ends up jumping out of the helicopter to ultimately kill Gronk, and to ultimately tell the guy like, dude, I got 12 minutes. Make it to the headquarters. Make it to the Clive Venter's headquarters. So yeah, I thought that this movie was really fun. Um, I really enjoyed the seemingly times of which that we would have it to where ultimately Roy would also just kill himself. So ultimately he would go to the next day. Like there's sometimes where he would like crash through a bus, like through a window of a bus and then die. Like there are other kind of several times where ultimately he would go and seemingly have a hillbilly esh like guy go and like hook him and like drag him uh, via his vehicle, and ultimately like, yeah, come get some. And so ultimately Avatar Roy ultimately goes and does the opposite to this hillbilly, to where ultimately he takes advantage of him, and then to where Roy does the opposite. He ends up going into the vehicle, and I'm like, yeah, come get some, and like, yeah, whatever, like, stupid hillbilly. Because ultimately we see like a wide variety of all of the characters that ultimately Roy is to defeat, and he goes in and has to make up a name for every single one of them, which I think is hilarious. Because he's like, yeah, I never knew any of these people's names, so I just have to make up a name for all of these people. Because yeah, like we have to where the hillbilly guy is named Smiley, and we end up having to where ultimately Roy starts to make up names for all these people because he's like, man, I've never really asked what their names were, and I ultimately just didn't care. So I thought that that was really interesting, and ultimately, I just really thought that this movie was fun. It was funny. Like there were some times where ultimately Roy would just let him get like pelted by bullets in some scenarios where he just like, dude, it like because there's a lot of times, especially during that helicopter scene, like he would completely forget about the helicopter scene because he's just thinking about something, and then ultimately you would just get pelted by the guy that comes out of the helicopter and kills him, which I thought was hilarious. I'm like, yeah, like he for like. It's kind of interesting whenever like Roy would forget about something because there's so much going on, and then ultimately you'd be like, oh, like I'm gonna die because of this, and so ultimately that's the fun part about this movie is you repetitiously get like really fun uh, scenes to go on here where you'd have it to where Roy is trying to follow the bouncing ball, or he realizes that there's no way that he's going to be able to get to be able to do things, so he dies to try the day over again to do them quite possibly better. So I'm gonna get out of here. I really enjoyed this movie, but other than that, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.